Hello, everyone, and welcome to Schmidtless Live. I'm Kurt Schmidt, president and partner at Foundry, and today's show is meant to educate and inspire leaders like yourself in design and technology. So I'm very excited today because I'm talking to Jackie Colburn, and I met Jackie through, my network, and she's amazing. And we're going to talk about all things design sprints because I don't know enough about them, and Jackie's going to teach me everything I need to know. And I'm excited for you to meet her, so I'm going to pump her in here real quick. There she is. Hi, Jackie.
Hello,
How
nice
you
to
doing?
see you. Always a pleasure.
Good to see you. So tell me a little bit about your background. How did you get into doing design sprints and consulting with folks on how to build better digital products?
Yeah, so how far back should we go?
That's up to you.
All right. Well, I spent my career working at a couple of different agencies, digital product studios in the Twin Cities,
Mm-hmm.
where I worked with teams to design and build products, primarily for clients, although I worked at Go-Kart Labs most recently, where
Yep.
we also had an incubation practice and launched some products from inside of the firm.
Mm-hmm.
And while I was at Go-Kart Labs, I read this book called Sprint. Highly recommended.
Highly recommended, yes.
Highly recommended. So this book was written by a couple of guys who were at Google Ventures, and they designed this process to prototype and test ideas with the startups that they were investing in. So I read the book when it came out, and I said, we got to try this. And started to run design sprints with teams at Go-Kart, saw how effective it was. Then I decided to go out on my own and launch my own practice running design sprints with teams. And it's been almost 4 years now.
Yeah.
And I've been having a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, and, every time we've been able to partner on certain things, I hear such rave reviews from the partners that we're working with on the way that you work and the process that you do. So, I'm super happy that you're doing this because it's something that's really needed, because I felt like, I spent a lot of time in design in the past, million years I've been doing this. And I think making design more accessible is really what makes me excited about the sprint process, bringing in, because 10 years ago I would have a client and we'd be like, what do you want? And they'd be like, here's a list of all the things it should do, and we'd be like, okay, we're going to go build that thing. And then we come back and we give it to them, and then they say, well, that doesn't actually solve my problem. And we're like, well, you're the dummy who told me it should do all these things. What do you expect me to do? But now we've got these things like design sprints where these people who you wouldn't call themselves designers, right, get to be a part of the process, get to be a part of designing what their future looks like. And do you feel that the sprint process is kind of the democratization of that strategy and design? Is that what it drew you to it?
Yeah, well, my background isn't in design. My background is in psychology, and I've always been fascinated by people, but also fascinated by helping people work well together.
Yeah.
And so the beauty of the design sprint is that it really is a process that brings team members together to work toward a solution. It brings people into the room who typically aren't in the room and allows them to co-create with the designers and the developers so that they're influencing what it is that we make. And they're also there as we're making decisions.
Yeah.
And then at the end, you take what you've made, your prototype, and you put it in front of 5 people to get feedback, 5 representatives of the target customer.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you really learn, is this something that is going to drive the outcomes that we want to see or solve the problem that we intend to solve for our customer? And you can't really argue with that type of feedback.
Yeah. Yeah. And I felt like this year, and that's a good segue, but talking about bringing everybody into the room. For this year, though, we've had to go virtual for most things. And I know at the beginning of the year, a lot of folks that I was talking to that run workshops and do some of the work that you do were a little nervous about what that was going to look like for the future. But recently, you and I chatted, and you'd said it's actually, there's been a lot of positives around it as well. What have you seen in terms of moving things virtually to do these sprints has improved, doing it that way versus getting everybody in a room.
Yeah, benefits. So benefits are you can work with a team of people in different locations without having to travel.
And different time
So
zones and all the things.
different time zones, different locations. Nobody has to get on a plane, which is a benefit for all people, because they don't have to be on airplanes. They don't have to expend that energy
Right.
that they
Live out of
may have to
hotel rooms
expend.
and
Yeah, living out of a hotel room. Obviously, the circumstances that we are dealing with that are making that travel so challenging are not great. And there are a lot of other stresses that people are dealing with.
yeah.
But I do find that, having people in their own home and their own space is an asset in that regard. So they're able to eat the food that they want to eat during breaks. They're able to sleep in their own bed, be with their family in the evening. And so then they're able to bring a lot more energy to the room, or to the virtual space when
Right.
we're working on solving a problem together. And another benefit is that you have a record of everything that you have done together.
Right. You're
So
just recording
when we're
everything, right?
using, well, you use a virtual whiteboard, and
Yep.
so Miro and Mural are the top two. I've been using Mural primarily for my design sprints, and at the end of the sprint, you've got a huge virtual whiteboard that has a record of all the decisions that you've made, all of the exploration that you've done.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that you can refer back to, and is a lot easier to see and use as a record than a bunch of photos of Post-it notes, which are what I would have had in the old in-person way
Yep.
of doing things.
Yep.
So.
No, I know the feeling of quickly having to scribble stuff down and catch things, and I'm sticking Post-it notes on me because I don't have the time to even get them on the wall fast enough. But using a virtual tool, obviously, people can be posting their notes wherever they want to, and it doesn't lean so much on you to be running around organizing all the things, because I know in some design sprints that I've been a part of, the tear down afterwards is an arduous process. Just collecting all the things. And then in many cases, you're probably just digitizing most of those Post-it notes later anyways, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yep.
Taking photos of them and putting them into either a folder or a deck or something that you can refer
so
back
then
to.
when it comes to choosing when to do a design sprint, okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about the remote stuff, but I get questions all the time from people about when should you be choosing to do a design sprint versus maybe just doing like a little discovery workshop or something like that. How do you, Jackie, coach people when they're like, I need a design sprint? What are some of the questions you ask them up front to get them, to figure out, is a design sprint something that can help them work towards solving their problem?
Well, I always ask why. If somebody comes to me saying they need a design sprint, I say, why do you think you need a design sprint? What is the problem that you hope to solve by running a design sprint? What does success look like for your company? What do you want to say after it's done? But typically, the best types of problems for a design sprint are those that are higher risk and have a higher degree of uncertainty. So if something, if you've got a lot of confidence or certainty around whether or not you should do something, then it may make sense to just go ahead and do it and not run a design sprint. But if you aren't sure, then it may make sense to do that work to put a prototype together and get feedback on it before you invest the time and resources in building it out.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a really good point, Jackie, because sometimes what I've seen people, get nervous about it, especially like higher up decision makers who don't really understand why we're doing what we're doing, is that's an expensive meeting, right? It's a lot of expense of people's time for 5 days, right? And there's very little time for them to do their actual work during that time, right? But I've seen definitely people coming out of these experiences with a kind of a new look at the way they work too. I think they learn a lot in the design sprint process. Maybe not exactly like I can turn around and go and do my own design sprints, but maybe bringing some of that type of thinking to the work that they're doing on a day-to-day basis. So there's not just the benefit of that prototype at the end, right? There's this
Mhm.
experience that you build on, right?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things I love that John Zaretsky says, he's one of the authors of the book, he often says that through doing a design sprint, you're able to focus on the work that really matters.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that because so often we are working, but we're just running from meeting to meeting and multitasking in such a way that we're not able to work on solving problems in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
And so when you take the time to sit down and focus on one thing with a team and make progress against it, I think it feels so much better, you know, in our souls,
Yeah. Yeah.
and you can have so much more impact in the organization through allowing yourself and creating the conditions to
Yeah.
allow yourself to work that way. And so I think, you know, I often will work with teams who come away feeling like, wow, I can't believe how much we got done. If we
Right.
had done it, you know, done it in the usual way, it would have taken months to, you know, make this level of progress. And so they feel inspired then to create, you know, more scenarios where they're able to work that way. Even if it's not a full design sprint, they may decide that they're willing to bring the team together to really collaborate and work through just a few different methods like mapping and, you know, making some choices together as a team, as opposed to just having it be so scattered and painful.
Yeah. Well, and you know that leads me to another question, Jackie. Is that, let's say I'm a person who's thinking about running a design sprint or hiring someone to come in and perform a design sprint for a problem that we have. What are some of the roles that you want to see in those design sprints? I know it might be a kind of a broad question, but from your experience, you know, should I just be getting the team together? What sort of decision makers do I want in there? What sort of makeup have you
Mhm.
seen where you get the most bang for your buck?
Well, the term, like the level of decision maker in the room completely varies. Sometimes
Okay.
it's a product owner, product manager. Sometimes it's the CEO of the company. So it
Okay.
just depends on the problem that you're solving. You need to make sure that there is a decider in the room who has the decision making authority that the team needs in order to move forward
Okay.
during the design sprint. So you never want it to be the case where the team feels like they're not empowered or able to make decisions during the work. You certainly want to have makers, so creatives who can put together a prototype. So, you know,
Yep.
that's oftentimes designers, UX designer, writer, and then somebody from the dev team is almost always their representative, not necessarily multiple dev team members, because
Okay.
as you know, you can certainly prototype without code these days using InVision or Figma.
Hmm.
But having somebody from the dev team present is awesome because they can help us make sure that we aren't making choices that might be a huge problem later on. It helps because then they're along for that journey and able to translate to the dev
Yep.
team when it gets to that point.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's
But
good.
the other thing is, you know, on day one, there's this section called Ask the Experts in the sprint, where you can have other people come in who maybe can't be there for the whole sprint, but who we want to weigh in. And so these could be, you know, people who work more closely with the customer, a customer service person or support person. It could be somebody from the marketing team. I've even had actual customers come in on that day in order to inform us
Mm.
as we're making decisions about where to focus and what to prototype.
Do you think that now that we're doing this remotely, what are sort of the tools and things that I need to think about having for a successful sprint, especially at the end when, you know, how are we presenting it to those end consumers, and what are some things that I should be thinking about as someone who's planning one of these?
So here's a plug. We do have this guide, at thesprintbook.com. There's a remote sprint guide. And
Okay.
it's got all of the recommended tools and steps for you to consider. Refer to that. I think
Okay.
the most important thing to do is to have a plan
Right.
and really think it through before you go in. I use Mural, as I mentioned, for my canvas, and we have a template that we built that you can also get from that remote sprint guide as a starting point. I use Zoom to facilitate the meetings, and I use Zoom to facilitate the discussions with the customer at the end.
Hmm.
I have the customer sign up via Calendly to get a slot, and then I record the interview so that then the team members can immediately watch it afterward. So those are, I mean, it's really just Mural and
Yeah.
Zoom are and Calendly are my go-to tools that I use to run my
That's
sprints.
awesome. Yeah. Don't make it harder than it needs to be, right?
Yeah, and use the tools that your team's comfortable with.
Mm.
So if your team is using Miro already, or Whimsical, or there's Envision Freehand. If they're already using a tool, stick with that. And odds are there's a template out there. I just saw that Steph Kushan of Design Sprint Limited created an Envision Freehand version of our template. So you can search, see if there's a template out there. You can also use Google Slides. So there are a lot of ways that you can
Yeah.
work. But pick the tool that's going to be best for your team, commit, think it through, come up with your plan end to end, and then go forth and
That's awesome.
sprint.
Well, and I also want to ask, about the maturity level of a company doing and using design sprints. As you mentioned, kind of 4 years ago is when you started, and over the past few years, what changes have you seen in using this tool to make better products or enhance better products? Have you seen more successful launches using this? Because I've kind of brought it up on other shows where I've said, years ago I would have to like explain what user experience was or UX was to a client and why it was important to do these wireframes and things up front when they were kind of like, don't you just make the design and go? What's wrong with you? But I feel like companies are a bit more mature now. They have a better understanding of design and its impact into the work that they have. I think there's still obviously lots of learning to do, but I feel that people are just generally a bit more mature when it comes to their organization's level of comfort and the way they lean on design more. What have you seen in the last 4 years? Are you seeing people coming in a bit more educated, or are you still having to do a lot of education on why this is important?
I think a lot of organizations value design and value the experience that their customers are having in a more meaningful way.
Okay.
I think that there's a shift to focusing on the customer. I mean, you hear about, is it Target and Best Buy talking about being customer obsessed? Like that's the latest, right? Which is great. I think it's amazing because I think that there's a shift away from this idea that we as the business are going to, come out with, all of these wonderful things, and
Yep.
then you will have them as we have defined them. There's a willingness to look to the customer, to understand their needs, to get their feedback in an iterative way,
Mhm.
which is amazing.
Yeah.
So I think that big picture shift is going a long way. I'm also finding that there are more people human-centered design, I feel like, is something that most people are familiar with. So that has helped the cause. And then in terms of the design sprint itself, I'm also finding that people have more familiarity with it. I think at this point they have at least heard of it.
Mm-hmm.
And have maybe some exposure to what it means to run a design sprint. But I still have to do a fair amount of coaching along the way to make sure that they understand the purpose and that we're set up to have a great workshop together.
That's awesome. So one other thing I wanted to ask you about, Jackie, was what happens after? Do I go into a post sprint depression, or what once I get that thing, what do you usually coach people on to do next? What's the life after sprint? And what should they be thinking about? What should they expect?
Yeah. So I always facilitate a team synthesis where we talk about what we learned, what those insights are, and what actions we want to take as a result of what we learned. So, I mean, it really depends on what you uncover during your sprint, but I think it's important to decide what your next steps are so that you don't just lose
Right.
momentum for the work, and that you are able to carry forward what it is that you've learned. Sometimes it is we're going to need to do more testing.
Okay.
So it could be that you're going to take the prototype and now you're going to actually build out a version of it, and then you're going to send some traffic to it and you're going to see what happens. Or that you're going to build another version of a prototype. You may need to do another sprint to do that or not. Maybe the UX team can just take forward what we've learned and build another version of the prototype, test it with another round of people. Um, there are a lot of different paths forward.
Mm-hmm. Just be open minded, right?
Well, be open-minded, be open to learning, be open to also be open to learning that people don't want what you've made.
Right.
I think that the tendency can be to feel like it's a fail if you prototype something and then you find out that, oh, it doesn't actually solve the problem, or the customer doesn't really want it. And I just had this conversation today with a client where I said, you know what, they don't want what we made. But the value here is that we got to a level of specificity where we could put it in front of them, they could understand what
Yep.
it was we were offering, and then they could say, you know what, I don't actually want that, but I want something like this.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't build out the offering and hire the team and invest in it because you were able to learn in a period of 2 weeks that, oh, this isn't actually what they wanted.
Yeah. Well, back to your point about have an understanding of human psychology, right? That's how I choose dinner. I know what I don't want. I don't know what I want. I don't know what I want, but
Uh-huh.
I'm pretty sure I know all the things I don't want. So if I see all the things I don't want, it starts to narrow it down for me. and
Mhm.
and I think to your point, I mean, I think I've also seen that sort of experience with folks too, is that they didn't know what they didn't want until they were kind of presented with it, and
Right.
then but then it also sparked some ideas in further conversations that then helped move it and pivot, for lack of a better word, to maybe a more solid idea or something worth more spending more time on. So yeah, it
Mhm.
makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. I oftentimes say, a picture's worth 1,000 words. That's a
Yeah.
saying we've heard many times.
Right.
So a prototype's worth how many? A prototype's worth a million words. But yeah, exactly that. So you can tell somebody about something and they're going to interpret your words in whatever way their mind chooses to
Yep.
interpret. But if you put an actual prototype in front of them and ask them to respond to it, well, then you've achieved a level of clarity about what that idea is through presenting that prototype that you
Yep.
could not achieve with language alone.
Right. And it's a smarter way of it's a smarter way of working that way, but that's not the stories we get told, right? We get told of these young entrepreneurs that, threw all this stuff at this thing, and all of a sudden, boom, they're rich, and they had this great idea and they just ran with it and drove it forward. Where what you don't see though is all the missteps and all the failures along the way, because we don't celebrate those, right?
Mm-hmm,
But
mm-hmm.
they've all had them. So what I really love, and kind of what I'm hearing from you, is the sprint process really allows you to build some guardrails to protect you from making it a bigger thing than it needs to be, or spending 6 months like we used to do making prototypes,
Mm-hmm.
and pushing them out and then being very disappointed. But then there's kind of this buyer's remorse almost, where you're like, well, we got to keep it going and keep changing it, a bit, but then it just dies like a year later or something because, you know,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
culturally we don't want to admit to failure, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
but if we contain it in this little experience that is really intense for a bit of time, and then we come out of it and we try stuff, it doesn't feel like a big failure if what comes out of it wasn't, because you didn't spend months and millions of dollars, right?
Exactly.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So let's say, I was considering, maybe this new line of business inside my organization, or pivoting my product, or, working towards these things. I'm sure you get this question all the time, and I know what the answer should be, but Do you
Oh, you
encourage
do?
people to always go out for a coach or try to solve this problem themselves? I know you mentioned like, hey, go get the book, go try it. I know you also
Yeah.
teach sprinting
Hmm.
classes. You teach lessons, right? But
True.
like my dad always said, you can teach a man to fish, but you should also bring a fish too, so they can, so they can be, not hungry while they're fishing, and while you're
Uh-huh.
teaching them to
Oh,
fish. Um, so
I bring a
how do
sandwich.
you approach that, that balance?
So there are a few ways you can get comfortable. One is, like I said, the book. Read the book.
Yep.
The other is I do teach, and we actually have a boot camp coming December 8th. It's in partnership with Jake and John, who wrote the book.
Okay.
So they have an online boot camp I'm helping them with. I'll be there doing some Q&A. So that is at thesprintbook.com if you are so
I'll
inclined to
put a link in the
take
show notes.
that. And then I also do coaching and training as a service. So I have, come in to big companies, run workshops on how to facilitate sprints where that is all that we're focused on. I
Mm-hmm.
also sometimes come in and actually facilitate a sprint where we're working on a specific problem, but a secondary outcome that we're hoping to see as a result is that the team gets comfortable and feels able to do it on their own
Mm-hmm.
after I leave. So you can find me at my website, JackieColburn.com.
JackieColburn.com. Yeah, and I've got all those links down in the show notes.
Yes, but I do think, the best thing to do is to try, at some point.
Yeah.
And it may be that you want to start small and just do, day one in the book or in the sprint process and get comfortable. Or you want to tackle a problem that is maybe a little bit lower risk
Mm-hmm.
for the company, or it's more of an experiment for your team where you're working on, it could be an internal project that you're going to apply the sprint process to, and you have an internal team working on solving a problem for your organization. There are a lot of ways that I think you can practice and get comfortable and build confidence.
Yeah, that confidence thing leads me to the last question that I had to ask you was, when should I know when to modify the sprint? Is it because I know that you've said before, not every problem deserves the exact same process, right? And
Mhm.
so, how do you know when to change it? Is it based on the product, the culture of the company, the makeup of the team? Is it a factor of all these things? Because for me, it's like, I obviously, if I was going to run my first design sprint, I would follow the book exactly, and maybe at
Mhm.
the end, I
Yep.
might be like, "Ooh, there were some parts in there that felt kind of weird," but I might not have the confidence as someone like you, Jackie, who's been doing it for so long, to know when to know when to modify. What are some of the signals for you, based on the teachings of the book, on when you look to modify the sprint?
Yeah, I mean, most of the time it's about how much clarity we have going in about the
Okay.
problem that we're solving. So when we have less clarity, I always assume that it will take the full 5-day cycle
Yeah.
roughly to run. If I come in and we have a lot of clarity, so we've identified the customer, we've identified the moment and the problem, and maybe the team has already started to do some exploration
Mm.
of what the solution might
And maybe
be,
some
then,
data around the problem too.
well, yeah, I mean, but we might be able to move a little bit faster
Okay.
um, to prototype if we have more clarity and less ambiguity going in.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I've definitely been approached by people sometimes where they've got a ton of customer data, they've got surveys done, they've got all these sort of things, but they haven't. What they have a hard time do is making decisions based off of all the definition and data that they have, and that's where I've seen also this sort of process be able to help find an outlet, a specific outlet for that clarity that you mentioned. I think is really powerful as well. So even if you're not a pie in the sky sort of like, we've got this great idea and we think there's a market for it, If you've already got a product and you want to change it and make some additions to it, and you've got tons of data, this process can still work for you. You would just modify it somewhat, because we already have so much knowledge around it. Now it's like, what do we do with that knowledge? Right.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you may not need to do ask the experts as an example on day one, because maybe you already have the input, and then you may decide that in order to have a meaningful work session on day one, that one person is going to do some synthesis and bring that in to kind of level set. But then, you're always orienting back to mapping out the customer journey and deciding what moment you want to focus on as you prototype. So I think what can happen is people can get like very swirly and spiraled up in all of their research and all of their data. And the process forces you to simplify in such a way that I think keeps that spiral from going out of control.
That makes sense. Okay. Actually, I have one last question too, because every time I talk to you, I keep thinking of questions. The one last thing I want to ask is, which part of the sprint would you tell or coach someone on that is probably going to be the more difficult part of the sprint, or could be messy, or just like you said, it could be some swirl or things like that? Is there a part that I should really be, is there a section of the sprint that I should really be focused on paying close attention to? Or is it all challenging? Challenging in a good way.
Yeah. I mean, it depends on
the group.
It depends on the group. It depends on your comfort level too, because here, I'll show this picture. So here are the days. Here we go.
Let me move.
It's reversed. Okay. So day one mapping is always the most swirly. And so that can be really challenging, especially if you're not comfortable with the ambiguity. You have to facilitate through it and get the team to a place where they are making a choice about what you're going to focus on. The last day testing, I think, can cause people a lot of anxiety too. So if you're not comfortable being in front of the customer, maybe you haven't done it often, or your team's just not comfortable, putting things out in getting feedback on them, then that test day can cause a lot of nerves. But you got to just take some deep breaths.
You got to get over yourself. Get something done.
Oh, you got to just, be comfortable with the discomfort. Take some deep breaths. Give it a try.
Yep. Nobody's going to die.
Well, they might. But could happen at any moment.
That's true. That's true.
Hopefully not. Hopefully not. Yeah.
I like it. Okay, Jackie. So you mentioned a whole bunch of things. I'm going to add links below to all those places. So if I want to connect with you, Jackie, to learn more about the work that you do and learn more about sprints, where should I go, and how can I get in contact with you?
Okay, best place, JackieColburn.com. I'm also on Twitter and LinkedIn under the same name. So if you want to visit, you can send me a message there.
Cool. Awesome. Well, Jackie, I want to thank you for spending the time with me today. I always enjoy our conversations. I learn so much, and the work you do is amazing. And I get nothing but amazing feedback from folks. So congratulations on all the success. It's really fun to watch.
Thanks. You too.
Yeah, appreciate that. Okay, we're going to say goodbye to Jackie, and I'm going to close up the show here. So if you enjoyed this show, and only if you enjoyed the show, you got to hit all the buttons, because YouTube's user experience isn't great. So you got to hit the subscribe, and you got to hit the notification, you got to hit the like, and all the things. Anyways, if you enjoyed the show, I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to spend time with me and Jackie. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you next week.